The first time I saw him, the world went quiet. Not silent. Quiet. In that strange, suspended way where every heartbeat feels like it's echoing through glass. The wind stopped moving. The leaves hung still. Even the flies circling the fence seemed to hover midair, waiting. His eyes found mine across the paddock, and something in me, something I didn't know I'd been holding, just broke. I'd come here to escape, not to feel. And yet, standing there, half hidden behind a chipped wooden gate, staring into the dark, liquid eyes of a horse I'd never met, I felt everything all at once. Grief, loneliness, wonder. He didn't move. Neither did I. The only thing between us was distance, a few meters of grass and a thin veil of fear I didn't know how to cross. I hadn't planned on being here. 3 weeks earlier, I'd packed what little I cared about into the back of my car and driven until the city disappeared in the rearview mirror. Until the noise became memory. Until I could finally breathe without someone telling me how. When I reached the edge of a small countryside town called Hemlock Ridge, I stopped. Not because I'd meant to, but because my hands wouldn't drive any farther. There was a sign that said, Maple Creek Stables, Training, Boarding, Rehabilitation, and below it, a smaller one, Help Wanted. It felt like an answer I hadn't asked for, so I turned in. The woman who ran the place, Anne, didn't ask many questions. She looked me over, probably saw the mess I was, and said, "Mornings start early here. You know how to handle horses?" "No," I admitted. She smiled faintly. "You'll learn." That was how I met him. His name was Ekko. Ekko wasn't like the other horses. I could tell even before I knew anything about him. While the others grazed lazily or nudged each other playfully in the field, he stood apart, tall, still, alert. A shadow against the afternoon light. His coat was black, but not the glossy kind you see in magazines. It was rough in patches, dulled by weather and time. His mane hung unevenly, a few strands tangled by the wind, and yet there was something regal in him. Something unbroken. Anne said he was new. A rescue. Came from a farm that went under, owned by people who stopped caring long before they gave him up. He'd been wild once, she said, before people tried to tame him too quickly. "Don't go near him yet," she warned. "He's not ready." But the truth was, I wasn't either. Maybe that's why I couldn't stay away. Every morning before dawn, I'd hear him, the soft thud of hooves against dirt, the low rumble of his breath. Sometimes a sharp snort that echoed through the quiet stables, sending a shiver up my spine. It became my routine to stop by his stall before the others woke. I'd stand there, half in the dark, holding a bucket of grain I knew he wouldn't take from me. He'd watch me, always watching. At first I couldn't tell if it was suspicion or curiosity, but the longer I stood there, the more it felt like recognition, as if he saw the same wild, wounded thing in me that I saw in him. On the 4th morning, I made a mistake. I reached out, just a little, not even touching, just offering my hand through the bars. He jerked back instantly, muscles tightening, eyes flashing. For a second, his breath came fast, ragged, and then he stomped once, loud and hard, the sound slicing through the air like thunder. I flinched so hard the bucket slipped from my fingers. The clang rang out through the barn, startling the other horses. I stumbled back, heart pounding. But when I looked up, he was still watching me. Not angry, not afraid, just searching, I whispered. "I'm sorry." He flicked his ear as if hearing me, then turned away. I didn't try again for days. Anne never asked about me, and I never volunteered much. But one evening, as we were closing up the stable doors, she said, "You've taken a liking to him." I shrugged. "He reminds me of someone I used to be." She smiled. That sad, knowing smile older women have when they recognize your pain, but don't pry into it. "Then maybe he's here for a reason," she said. I didn't answer. But that night I dreamed of him, standing in a field of fog, his eyes the only clear thing in the haze. When I reached for him, he didn't move away. The first time he let me near was an accident. Anne had left early, and I stayed behind to finish cleaning. Ekko's stall was at the far end, where the light from the single bulb barely reached. I was sweeping when I felt it. That shift in the air, like gravity itself had turned toward me. I looked up. He was standing at the open stall door, the latch somehow undone, his body half in shadow. For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. Then he stepped forward. Slow, measured. I froze, broom still in my hands. My pulse thundered in my ears. His hooves made no sound on the hay. His head lowered slightly, nostrils flaring as he took in my scent. I should have stepped back, should have called for help, but I didn't, because the way he looked at me, steady, unblinking, I couldn't move. It wasn't fear. It was something deeper, something like recognition. When he was close enough that I could feel the warmth of his breath against my arm, I whispered, "Hey there." He blinked, and then, so softly I almost didn't feel it, he brushed his muzzle against my sleeve. Just once. A single, fragile moment. Then he turned and walked back into his stall. After that, everything changed. He began to follow me with his eyes when I passed. When I cleaned his stall, he stayed near the door instead of retreating to the far corner. Sometimes when I spoke to him, about nothing, just words spilling out, his ears would tilt forward, listening. Anne noticed, of course. "He's warming to you," she said one morning, leaning on the fence as we watched him graze. "You've got patience. Most people don't." I didn't tell her that it wasn't patience. It was fear of what I'd become without connection, of how quiet my life had gotten. Ekko filled that space without trying. One late afternoon, the sky turned bruised and heavy with rain. I'd stayed later than usual, mending a fence post that had come loose. By the time I finished, the wind had picked up, carrying the scent of a storm. I ran toward the stable, calling out to Anne, but she was gone, probably already home before the worst of it. Lightning cracked across the sky, close enough to make the ground tremble. Inside, the horses were restless, snorting, stamping, pacing, but Ekko was the worst. He threw his head, striking the stall door with his hoof. The sound was sharp, frantic. His eyes rolled white, muscles straining. "Hey," I called softly, stepping closer. "It's okay. It's just a storm." He didn't calm. Another thunderclap split the air, and he reared, slamming his body against the gate. The latch groaned. I dropped the broom and moved without thinking. "Ekko!" He froze mid-motion, ears flicking toward me. I raised my hands, voice shaking but gentle. "You're safe, okay? You're safe." The rain pounded on the roof, deafening, but my words seemed to find him anyway. His breathing slowed, shallow at first, then deeper. I stepped closer, 1 inch at a time, until I was beside him. The storm screamed outside, but inside that stall, time felt still. I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched his neck. His skin twitched beneath my palm, muscles taut. But he didn't pull away. I could feel his heartbeat, fast, strong, wild. And in that moment, it felt like it synced with mine. I leaned closer, whispering over the sound of rain. "We're okay. We're both okay." When he finally exhaled, it sounded like relief. The thunder rolled on, but it no longer felt threatening. It felt like music, loud, alive, something that reminded us both we were still here. After the storm, I stayed by him until the air turned still again. When I finally stepped back, his eyes followed me. They were calmer now, but deep. Endless, almost human in their quiet understanding. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel broken. In the weeks that followed, Anne began trusting me with more, feeding, grooming. Eventually, leading Ekko to the paddock. The first time I clipped the rope to his halter, my hands shook. But he didn't flinch. He just breathed, deep and steady, like he was reminding me to do the same. We walked side by side, the sound of hooves and footsteps blending together. Outside, the world glowed with the warmth of late spring, sunlight catching on dust, turning it to gold. When we reached the field, I unhooked the lead, expecting him to bolt. But he didn't. He stayed. He turned toward me, head lowered, eyes soft. I reached up and touched his muzzle. His breath was warm against my palm. In that single moment, it felt like everything that had gone wrong in my life, every loss, every silence, had been leading me here. To this. To him. Sometimes, late at night, I think about that first look, the one that stopped me in my tracks, that held me like gravity itself had chosen me for a reason. It wasn't magic. It wasn't fate. It was trust, and trust, I've learned, doesn't come in grand gestures. It comes in small ones, a step forward instead of away, a breath taken instead of held, a look that says I see you, even when the rest of the world doesn't. He saw me, and I saw him, and for the first time since my world fell apart, I finally believed that maybe, just maybe, I could start again. The next morning, the world smelled like rain and fresh earth. I woke earlier than usual, long before the sun had climbed over the hills, and for a moment I didn't know why. Then I heard it. That soft, rhythmic sound that had become as familiar to me as my own heartbeat. Hooves against the ground. Ekko. He was already awake when I reached the stable, head stretched over the stall door, eyes catching the faint light that crept in from the window. His coat looked darker in the half-shadow, a sheen of dew clinging to his mane. "Couldn't sleep either, huh?" I whispered, setting the feed bucket down. He blinked, slow and calm, then snorted softly as if answering. I reached for the brush, my fingers cold from the morning air. When I started brushing him, he didn't move away this time. The brush glided through the coarse strands, pulling loose bits of dust and dried hay. The sound was steady, soothing, the quiet kind of rhythm that builds its own kind of peace. Sometimes, I forgot how much healing could happen in silence. The first rays of sunlight spilled through the wooden slats, turning the floating dust into gold. I could feel his breathing, the rise and fall of his chest against my arm. He was so big, so impossibly strong, and yet, in that stillness, there was something so gentle about him. I had never known a presence like that. By the time I finished, the stable had filled with light. He turned his head slightly, pressing his muzzle against my shoulder. It wasn't a nudge for food or attention. It was something else, a kind of quiet acknowledgement. I smiled through the sting in my eyes. "You're not supposed to make me emotional before breakfast." He blinked again, unbothered. Later that day, Anne asked if I wanted to help with training. "Training?" I repeated, startled. "I'm not ready. Neither is he," she said with a faint grin. "That's why you'll do fine." I didn't know whether to laugh or run. But by noon, I was standing in the small corral, sunlight reflecting off the thin layer of dust that floated in the air. Ekko stood a few feet away, his lead rope loose in my hand. Anne leaned on the fence, watching. "He trusts you. Just walk with him. Let him set the pace." Easy for her to say. My pulse thudded in my ears. Every small sound, the squeak of leather, the flap of a bird's wing in the distance, felt amplified. I took one cautious step forward. He mirrored it. Another. Still he followed, slow, deliberate, his head tilted toward me. When I stopped, he stopped. When I breathed, he breathed. It was like being tethered to something invisible and alive, something larger than myself. Anne's voice came, soft but steady. "Good, now turn." I pivoted gently, and he turned with me, his hooves brushing through the dust. A warmth spread through me, part disbelief, part wonder. For months, I'd felt like a ghost, moving through life without truly being seen. And yet here I was, in the middle of a field, connected to this wild, wounded creature as if we shared the same pulse. When Anne finally said, "That's enough," I didn't want to stop. That night, I wrote for the first time in years. The words came slow at first, small fragments, pieces of feeling that didn't fit anywhere else. But once they started, they didn't stop. I wrote about him, about the way his breath warmed the air between us. the way his eyes seemed to hold entire storms inside them. When he looks at me, I wrote, "It's not like being seen. It's like being understood." The days turned into weeks, and I began to learn his language. The twitch of his ears, the way he shifted his weight when nervous, the low rumble of sound he made when content. I learned how to move slowly, how to listen without words. I learned patience, and he learned me. Some mornings, when I arrived at the stables, he'd nicker softly, a low, vibrating sound that felt like the closest thing to joy I'd heard in years. Anne noticed. "He's different with you," she said one afternoon as we watched him trot in the paddock. "He hasn't let anyone get that close since he came here." I didn't answer, because I knew what she meant, and I wasn't sure if that kind of closeness was something to be proud of or something to be afraid of. Then came the day of the accident. It was late summer. The air was heavy with heat, the kind that makes the world shimmer. We were supposed to be practicing groundwork again, just simple walking and halting, but something felt off. Ekko was restless, tossing his head, stamping his hooves. The sky had been strange all morning, thick, swollen clouds gathering on the horizon, carrying the promise of a storm. I tried to soothe him, voice soft, hand steady. "Hey, easy, it's okay," but I could feel it. That electric tension that hums before lightning. A sudden crack split the sky in two, so loud it made the earth jump beneath us. Ekko startled hard, rearing up. The rope snapped taut in my hand, yanking me forward. For a second, everything blurred. Sound, motion, breath. I stumbled, the world spinning. His shadow loomed above me, massive and wild. Then, somehow, he stopped. Mid-panic, mid-motion, his front hooves hit the ground inches away from me. His sides heaved. His chest rose and fell, fast and sharp. I froze, trembling, the broken rope hanging loose from my wrist. He looked at me then. Truly looked. And the storm outside felt small compared to the one behind his eyes. Something passed between us in that breath. Not fear, not apology. Something older, deeper. I took a slow step forward, my hand shaking. "It's okay," I whispered. "I'm not leaving." His ears flicked, his breathing slowed. And then, so carefully it almost didn't feel real, he lowered his head until his nose brushed the ground beside my knee. It was the closest thing to trust I had ever seen. After that day, we changed. Anne called it progress. I called it a kind of miracle. He followed me everywhere now. If I stopped by the fence, he'd come stand beside me, shoulder to shoulder. When I brushed him, he'd lean into the touch, eyes half closed, the same way people lean into safety. He let me braid his mane, something Anne said he'd never tolerated before. "Looks like you found your rhythm," she said one evening, handing me a bucket of water. I smiled. Or maybe he found mine. But healing isn't a straight line. One morning, when the fog lay thick over the fields, a new horse arrived. A young chestnut mare with wide, frightened eyes. The stable buzzed with noise as workers let her in, hooves clattering on the ground. Ekko tensed instantly. He pawed at the dirt, ears pinned back, tail flicking sharply. His whole body spoke in warnings I didn't yet understand. "Easy," I murmured, moving closer. He turned his head, eyes locking on me. Wild, uncertain. For a second I thought he might lash out. Not at me, but at the memory of what once hurt him. I reached out slowly, palm open. "Hey, I'm here." For a moment, the air between us crackled with something that felt like fear and faith colliding. Then his muscles loosened. His ears flicked forward again. He breathed out. It struck me how fragile trust really is, how it hangs by threads, invisible but powerful, how easily it can snap. That night, when the new mare whinnied through the dark, he answered, low, calm, protective. I smiled from where I stood in the doorway. He was learning to forgive the world again. By autumn, the leaves began to fall, and everything around us softened. I'd grown stronger, not just in skill, but in presence. I could feel it in the way my steps matched his, in the steadiness of my hands. Anne started talking about writing him. The thought both thrilled and terrified me. The first time I climbed onto his back, my knees felt like water. The world tilted. Every instinct screamed, "You don't belong here." But then he shifted beneath me, slow, steady, waiting for me to breathe. When I did, he moved. Each step was deliberate, careful, as if he knew exactly how fragile I felt. The sound of his hooves echoed through the field, rhythm matching the steady beat of my heart. We moved together, one creature, one heartbeat, and somewhere in the motion, something in me began to heal that no one could see. It was Anne who noticed first. "You're different," she said one evening, handing me a cup of coffee as the sun sank low behind the stables. "You used to walk like you were apologizing for taking up space." "Not anymore," I laughed softly. "Maybe I'm just too tired to apologize now." She smiled. "No, you learned to exist." I glanced toward the paddock, where Ekko stood watching the horizon, the last light glinting off his coat. "Maybe I just learned it from him," I said quietly. As the weeks passed, I started to ride him more often, early mornings when mist clung to the grass, and the world felt untouched. He always waited for me by the fence, ears pricked, breath fogging the air. When I approached, he'd lower his head, as if greeting an old friend. We'd ride through the open field behind the stables, where the grass grew tall and the wind carried the scent of pine. There was freedom there. Pure, unspoken freedom. The kind that comes only after you've lost everything else. I stopped thinking about who I'd been before. About the city, the failed marriage, the noise that once filled every silence. The ache that used to live in my chest had been replaced by something else. Not happiness exactly, but peace. One evening, the sun dipped low, painting everything gold. I was brushing Ekko down, humming quietly, when Anne walked in holding a folded letter. "It's for you," she said, handing it over. "Came in the post this morning." The handwriting was familiar. Too familiar. Daniel, I hadn't heard from him in months. My stomach twisted as I unfolded the paper. "Clara," it read, "I heard you left the city. I don't know where you are, but I hope you're well. I was wrong about a lot of things. I just wanted you to know that." There was no signature, no return address. Just those words, like an echo from another life. I stood there for a long time, staring at the letter, the sound of Ekko's breathing filling the silence. Anne touched my shoulder. "You okay?" I nodded slowly. "Yeah, I think I am." I tore the letter into small pieces and dropped them into the feed bucket. Ekko turned his head, watching. "It's over," I whispered to him. "All of it." He exhaled, a deep, steady sound that felt like agreement, and for the first time, I believed it. That night, I stayed with him long after the others had gone. The moon hung low, silver light spilling across the floor. He shifted his weight, his eyes reflecting the glow. I sat against the stall door, knees pulled to my chest, just listening to him breathe. It struck me how far we'd both come. From fear to trust. From silence to something like understanding. The way he looked at me that first day, that stillness, that mirror of my own pain had once paralyzed me. Now, it moved me, because I understood what it meant. It wasn't just recognition, it was forgiveness. And maybe, just maybe, it was love, not the fragile, fleeting kind that people break over and over, but the quiet, steadfast kind that stays even when words run out. That night, I didn't go back to the house. The barn was warm and quiet, filled with the slow rhythm of breathing and the faint rustle of hay. I sat beside Ekko's stall, a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, listening to the way his hooves shifted gently against the ground. Every so often, he'd lower his head to where I sat, as if to check that I was still there. It felt right. The stillness, the soft heartbeat of another life so close to mine. For months, I'd been building a version of myself out of broken pieces, afraid to see what shape it might take when it was finally whole again. But now, surrounded by that calm, I realized maybe wholeness wasn't about what I'd lost. It was about what had found me. The wind pressed softly against the roof, and a few loose strands of straw brushed my wrist. I let my eyes close, trusting the dark for the first time in years. I woke to sunlight spilling across the barn floor. The world outside had turned to gold, and somewhere nearby, the first birds were calling. I sat up slowly, blinking against the brightness. Ekko was watching me. He stood perfectly still, eyes soft and clear, the early light catching the faint lines of his face. There was something ancient in that gaze, something that felt like knowing. "Morning," I murmured, voice low from sleep. He took a step closer, then another, stopping only when his muzzle was inches from my shoulder. His breath brushed against my skin, warm and steady. For a moment, everything that had ever hurt me felt far away. Anne found us like that. She smiled when she saw the blanket and the empty coffee mug beside me. "You stayed here?" I nodded. He didn't want to be alone. Her eyes softened. "Maybe you didn't either." She wasn't wrong. We talked for a while about chores, about how the autumn fairs were coming soon, about how Ekko might be ready to show again someday. But beneath all of it, I could feel something shifting, the way the air changes right before the seasons turn. It wasn't fear anymore that followed me. It was possibility. Over the next few weeks, the world kept changing. The fields turned copper, the mornings colder. I'd wake early to see frost painting the fences, thin and silver. The breath of every horse rose like smoke into the dawn. Ekko grew stronger with each day. He moved with quiet confidence now, his steps no longer hesitant but sure. Watching him run across the paddock became the kind of miracle I didn't know how to explain. Not because he was fast, but because he was free. Sometimes, I'd run alongside him, laughing breathlessly, boots slipping in the dirt. The sound of hooves and heartbeat would blur together until I couldn't tell which was mine. Anne would watch from the fence, shaking her head with a smile. "You two," she'd say. "It's like watching the same soul in two different bodies." I never answered. But she wasn't wrong. Then came the call. It was a gray morning when the phone rang. The kind of day where clouds hung low and heavy, promising rain. I was in the tack room, polishing the worn leather of Ekko's bridle, when Anne appeared at the door, holding out her phone. "It's for you." "Me?" She nodded. "A woman named Grace. Says she's from the old farm where Ekko came from." My stomach tightened as I took the phone. "Hello?" "Hi," the voice said softly. "You must be Clara. I hope this isn't a bad time." "No, not at all. I just wanted to thank you." Anne told me how well he's doing. "Ekko. Well, we called him Maverick back then." Her voice trembled slightly. "My father, he passed away last year. Things got bad at the farm, and we couldn't keep all the horses. But Maverick, he was always special. My father used to say that Horse would only ever listen to someone who understood silence." I swallowed hard, the words catching somewhere deep. "He found that someone," she said. "I just wanted you to know how much that means." When the call ended, I stood there for a long time, phone still in my hand. Ekko was outside, his dark shape framed against the pale sky. "He was always special," she'd said. I looked at him through the window and whispered, "He still is." That evening I took him out to the field. The sun was sinking, spilling crimson across the hills. The air was sharp and clean. We walked without a lead rope, side by side, our shadows stretching long behind us. He stopped suddenly, ears twitching toward the horizon. The wind carried the faint scent of rain. "What is it?" I asked softly. He turned to me, and in his eyes I saw it. The same thing I'd seen that first day. That quiet, powerful stillness. That question that wasn't really a question at all. I stepped closer, my hand resting against his neck. "I'm not going anywhere," I whispered. He exhaled, the sound deep and full. Somewhere far off, thunder rolled, but it didn't scare either of us this time. We stood together until the sky went dark, until the stars began to bloom above us. Winter came quietly. Snow settled over the fields like a blanket, soft and endless. The days were short. The nights were long. But the barn stayed warm, filled with the comforting smell of hay and the steady sound of life. Ekko's breath would rise in pale clouds each morning. He'd nudge my shoulder impatiently when I was slow with breakfast, his eyes bright, full of mischief. He was healthy now, stronger than I'd ever seen him. Sometimes, Anne would joke that he was the one keeping the place running. Not her. Don't tell him that, I'd reply, laughing. He'll start demanding a salary. But beneath the laughter, there was a weight I couldn't name. A quiet awareness that everything, even healing, has its seasons. It happened in early spring. The snow had melted, leaving the ground slick with mud. The air smelled like new grass. I'd taken Ekko out to the far pasture, the one that bordered the creek. The light was perfect, golden, shifting through the branches. He trotted beside me, tail flicking, hooves sinking into the soft earth. Everything felt easy. Right. Then, without warning, he stumbled. Just a small misstep, barely noticeable, but I saw it. The slight falter, the uneven catch of his leg. I stopped immediately, heart kicking up. He stood still, breathing fast, ears flicking in confusion. I crouched to check his leg, hands shaking. No blood, no swelling. Just tension, pain beneath the skin. Anne came running when I called. She examined him carefully, her brow furrowed. Probably just a strain. We'll rest him. I nodded, relief and fear tangling together. We led him back slowly, the sun dipping low behind us. Days passed. He rested. He grew restless. I brushed him daily, spoke to him softly, but his energy had shifted, quieter, heavier. He hated being still. He wanted the wind again, the open space. Anne said to give it time. I tried. But one morning, when I arrived early, I found him lying down. He lifted his head when he saw me, eyes calm but tired. I knelt beside him, the cold of the earth seeping through my jeans. "Hey," I whispered. "Don't scare me like that." He blinked, slow and deliberate. His breath fogged the air between us. Anne came soon after, phone in hand, calling the vet. But even before she hung up, I knew. I knew because he looked at me the way he had that first day. Deep, still, unmovable. The kind of look that feels like both a beginning and an ending. I pressed my forehead against his, tears falling onto his coat. "It's okay," I said through the shaking. "You don't have to hold on for me." He exhaled, one long, steady breath, and the world went quiet again, just like it had the day I met him. The vet came. The world kept turning. Anne stood beside me, her hand resting on my shoulder. "He was old," she said softly. "He had a good ending. You gave him that. But endings aren't good. They just are." For days, I couldn't walk past his empty stall. The silence there felt too alive, too heavy. And yet, one evening, when the light stretched long through the cracks in the door, I found myself standing there again. The air still smelled faintly of him. Rain, hay, warmth. I reached out, resting my hand on the wood. "Thank you," I whispered. It was strange how the words didn't hurt. They felt like release. We buried him under the oak at the edge of the field. Anne and I worked in silence. The wind was gentle that day, carrying the scent of wildflowers. I painted his name on a small wooden sign, Ekko, and placed it in the ground. When I stepped back, the world felt different. Lighter somehow, because even though he was gone, he hadn't really left. He was in the sound of the wind through the trees, in the rhythm of hooves I still heard in my dreams, in the calm that had taken root inside me. Months later, I took a new horse into the paddock, a young bay gelding with uncertain eyes. He flinched when I raised my hand, the same way Ekko once had. I stood still, letting him breathe. "Hey," I said softly. "It's okay. You're safe here." He blinked, and I smiled through the ache in my chest, because I understood now what it meant to be patient, to wait, to see without forcing, to love something not because it was easy, but because it was real. That night I stood on the hill behind the barn, the stars bright and endless above me. The air was cool, the grass whispering around my ankles, and in the distance, faint but certain, I could almost hear it, the sound of hooves. Ekko's run, the rhythm that had once carried me from fear to freedom. I closed my eyes, smiling. He had taught me everything that mattered. That strength doesn't roar, it listens. That healing doesn't happen in isolation, but in connection. And that sometimes, when you meet the right soul, even one covered in dust and scars, you don't have to say a word. You just stand there, and you let yourself be seen. My name is Clara Hart, and once I met a horse who looked at me so deeply I couldn't move. Because in that gaze I finally saw myself. Not as broken, not as lost, but as something worth finding again.